So today I want to talk about my site-responsive practice, experimental interventions, and my use of photographic materials. I'll show you images from over the last 5 years of 3 projects, including Shed, Tideland, and Littoral Landscape, which is down in 1CO3. And also I'll show you images from the exhibitions that follow the projects. In my art practice, I incorporate photography, video, and installation to examine the interactions between natural and human environments. Through multisensory experimentation, I search for visual and metaphorical links between human and natural cycles. I locate my studio at the periphery where organic and human processes are in constant exchange. Whether at the outskirts of the city or the water's edge, remote locations open up space for discovery and wonder and freedom from structured thought. There, I collaborate with the climate, geography, and ecosystem as a way to deepen my investigation into the metabolism, erosion, and evolution of littoral landscapes. This is a video still of one of my first videos when I was working at the Shed during the Shed project, and I was documenting birds turning this shed into a giant birdhouse. It's called Layers, and it describes some of my interests in terms of my research with overlapping environments on the edge of the city. In my photographic practice, I use light to investigate how a 2-dimensional surface can evoke 3-dimensional space. I'm interested in the ways that images can inhabit space and take on a physical presence. Sometimes when I'm documenting my 3-dimensional installations, I come up with an image that I'm really excited about. This one in print form is much nicer than it is projected. I live in the established semi-rural neighborhood of Charleswood, which it has a history of natural, agricultural, and residential habitats. This is all changing due to the encroachment of suburban housing. In 2011, Foxtail barley took over the fields in my area, and strong winds blew the seeds into the nearby forest floor. And I was thinking about the invasion of foxtail barley as an interspecies competition that paralleled the demand for suburban living. So this is what kind of got me excited about working in the Shed. I gave up control in the darkroom to work outside in unpredictable conditions, to allow natural processes to affect my prints. I continued using photographic paper in a haptic and intimate way. My experiments became slower, organic, and immersive. This is from a series that I did in 2012 of lumen images that were exposed outside using photographic paper, the seeds from the Shed, and glass that I found in the Shed. And these were actually also printed onto glass. So an abandoned grain shed, as I showed you earlier, sits at the edge, the forest edge near my house in Charleswood. I received permission from the developer owner to do a photo-based installation or intervention in the building. And so that spring I photographed the foxtails that had been decomposing in the forest, and I printed them onto 9-foot sheets of vellum on both sides of the vellum. There's 9 here, but I think I did 12 or 13 prints in total. And then I cut the prints up slice them up by hand. And this shows kind of what my plan or intention was to put these into the building. Here I am threading the photographs, and it took me quite a while to basically the cutting of the Shed and the threading of the photographs. It was a very slow, immersive, and multisensory experience. And so I kind of became rooted in the Shed. And I gained a physical understanding of the site by doing that. The forest floor was entangling the Shed in a process of decline and regeneration. So the prints remained in the building over the summer months. The weather, the rain and the sun, there was a lot of rain that year, and the insects, the barn swallows, and the rotting walls collaborated to alter the prints. The barn swallows did leave some things on the prints for me. During this phase, I studied the ways that human and natural ecosystems coexist and interact. I was thinking about the parallels between the decaying photographs and the building as materials that are both in constant change and moving towards futility. In 2014, I had an exhibition at Ace Art. The installations dialogued with the architecture to create an immersive environment that transported visitors in time and space. So the video at the back is called Shed Route, and what I did was I documented I was on the inside of the building and my camera was on a tripod outside, so I couldn't really see what was going on outside, but I was threading the photographs through the building on a windy day. So it created an interesting video that kind of looked like the strips of the foxtail seeds decomposing. They were flapping in the wind like tentacles or like roots. And the piece on the right is detritus. It's a 25-foot wall of the actual strips that I took out of the building that took over half the gallery. So this is a close-up of those strips, and it shows how the shed left its impression. So like the rain, there was a lot of rain that summer, and it was really hard because of the sun and the heat. The strips shrunk, and they were really tight in the building. And I wanted to have them in the exhibition, so it took me a long time to take them out. Some of them ripped, and it was like the shed didn't want to give them back. They were already having this process of, they were becoming part of the ecosystem. And so, yeah, nature had basically taken over and left its impression. The shed left its impression on the vellum. And in a large empty space, you can see it, a window light fades in and out as it moves along the floor to evoke the passage of time and weather. And I say weather is because it was fading in and out as if, clouds were blocking the light. Lapse is a computer animation. That's the light, the window light, made from a photograph of the shed window light. It's an example of how I use a photograph to transport the viewer beyond the walls of the gallery space. So suspended near the rafters was also was a nest, and it was also made up of strips that had weathered in the shed. So during my research at the site, I shared the space with barn swallows. It wasn't planned, they were there. They're experts at appropriating human structures. And I wondered what it would be like if they had used my photographs to build one of their nests, because I'd seen them over a couple of years having their young there. So I was also thinking about their displacement and their eventual displacement, and also how the nest mirrored the shed as an abandoned and obsolete structure. So I called this uproot. These are pieces that I sliced by hand into the thin threads. I was documenting my work inside the building, and the strong wind was blowing the door open, and it was really annoying. And it was disrupting everything, and I decided, well, I'm going to just make a piece about that. This is called Disturbance. It's a multisensory video installation that situates visitors in the gallery in the shed on a windy day. A creaking door swings open and shut with a blinding flash of light. And I used the surfaces of that space, like the two walls and the floor, to create like a three-dimensional image. And it was immersive because it was in a space in the gallery. It's a secluded space. At the same time, I also had I was part of a group show at Art Gallery of Southwestern Manitoba. This is a piece called Unusual Migration, and it kind of the idea was that, well, these strips were also in the shed. It was my first experiment. And the idea was that the images of the foxtail seeds and the photographs themselves mimicked the seeds that were collecting inside the building. In 2015, I was invited to Derry, Northern Ireland, to participate in a new artist residency program between Void Gallery and the Social Studios and Gallery. My plan was to research the 17th century stone wall that surrounds Derry. And then I was to have do a site-responsive installation in a gallery space. I became interested in dry stone walls that were used to divide land in the rural parts of Ireland in the 19th century. They still exist, and I was really curious about them, so I wanted to go and find them. And of course, going out to the rural parts of Ireland led me to, well, not of course, but I ended up on the edge of the countryside there on the ocean. And yeah, it was quite fascinating because I'm standing on top of an 8 or 10 foot stone wall. I was quite surprised that the ocean would create this, and I sort of saw this parallel between the stone wall in Derry, you know, the urban stone wall, and then the natural stone wall in the ocean. And I really wanted to make work there. Also, the dry stone walls, I wanted to mention that they were part of Ireland's history of agriculture and colonization, and I kind of made this link between this shoreline and the shed in Charleswood. So I made several trips to the beach, probably 4, and I wrapped stones with photographic paper and left them for days at a time to be exposed to the coastal climate. So you can see I think you can see the rain happening. I used a darkroom tray to collect seawater and then soak the paper. And I also wrapped stones in a similar way in the gallery space and left them on a ledge on the north-facing part of the gallery, on a window ledge, to be exposed to different light. And so there were these different qualities of light that created tonal values in the paper, and I think I always think of that because of my darkroom days. So the stones became this mixture of urban and coastal exposures, and it created this neat texture. My residency exhibition was called Tideland, and it consisted of photo-based sculpture, video and sound recording, and various cameraless images of water, stones, and seaweed. The work corresponded to the gallery architecture. So this is called dry stones, and I placed these into these 2 small rooms, and I was thinking about the tide coming into the gallery space and what it would look like if it sort of pushed the stones in and then discarded them. Wave is a cameraless image. This is an enlargement of a cameraless image that I did on that I made on the shoreline, on the sand. I was trying to capture impressions of sand, and the ocean tide obviously had a different idea, and it came up and ruined my experiment. And then after I decided to dry the image and scan it, the water marks appeared, maybe some raindrops as well, because it rained on and off constantly there. And I decided to invert the image into a positive because lumen prints are actually negative images outside. And this is the positive, and I liked the color of it, so I printed it on vinyl. And I was thinking about if the tide came in to the gallery, the water might start seeping underneath the window ledge. Next to that was the video projection and sound audio component. And this I did call Tideland, this video. So it's the interplay between wind, water, sand, and light is what I was exploring. It also loops constantly, which most of my videos do. So a few months later, a friend back in Winnipeg told me about this stone beach on Lake Winnipeg. I was really thinking about flat stones, and we had this conversation, and he knew about this beach. So he sent me photos by email, and when I saw them, I was really excited, and that's how I started my next project on Lake Winnipeg. So I'm just going to play this and then read a quote that kind of resonated with me. In his writing about shorelines and littoral landscapes, Neil Alexander observes that between land and sea is the beach, an ambiguous littoral zone in which elemental forces, rocks, water, air, sun, are in constant interanimation. He concurs with Kuklain King that a beach is one of the most variable landforms. It can be there one day and gone the next. Alexander conveys that, as a place, the shoreline has an irreducibly ambivalent character, for it is perpetually in a state of displacement. moving its position and altering its shape in response to the unceasing motions of the tide. I took my first road trip up to a remote stone beach north of Hecla Grindstone Provincial Park. I wanted to investigate the spring thaw. So I made video and audio recordings on the frozen shoreline as it was melting. Standing on the opaque ice, I asked myself what is going on below the surface. I wondered if the lake was dormant. It reminded me of the latent image that you can't see on photographic paper until it emerges in the darkroom developer. What would reveal itself as the ice disappeared? I tried to capture the formation of meltwater in both moving images and photographic paper exposures. So this is kind of a layering of images. It's an intersection of lumen prints and video and sound recording. As the white ice becomes watery, it turns light green and then becomes more saturated until the screen blacks out at the end, hence the name. So this piece examines the lack of oxygen in our aquatic ecosystems due to nutrient leaching. Shallow Deep is another video in the gallery installation downstairs. On the beach, I was noticing water rising up and down, rising and falling in the stones. It was really meditative to watch this, and so I decided to put the camera on that at close range. In my urban studio, I responded to the video by changing my breathing to correspond with it, with the fluctuating water movements, to just interpret what the lake was saying in its movement. Visits to the site were challenging because I had to carry a lot of equipment, and I had a container of paper that I was using, and the weather had to cooperate. The stones on this beach were saucer-shaped, unlike the ones in Ireland, and they're made of dolomitic limestone from the Red River Formation, dating back 450 million years. This made me think about time in a different way. I felt a sense of urgency in the making of this work because I knew that my visits were kind of few and far between. Over several trips, I wrapped dozens of the stones and left them for months to be exposed to the elements of this particular shoreline. As the installation changed, there was also an element of surprise that inspired my return over a dozen times to this shoreline. As most of you know, Lake Winnipeg is shallow and prone to wind setups, which create powerful waves. This action created rows of stone ridges along the beach that kind of mimic the waves themselves. And I kind of assumed that these were created over a very long period of time, but when I returned after the first week, I found that they had moved over my installation. So the ridges were being created very quickly. So my first reaction was to move them, to save some of them, and I couldn't get them all, but I did, the ones that I did keep, or save I should say, were moved to a water hole off the edge of the shoreline. While the project was underway, the forest tent caterpillars arrived. They swarmed the shoreline and were swimming in the water hole, which was kind of fun to watch. I didn't know they could swim. And this kind of made this connection to like the ancient trace fossils that I was finding on the beach. They were all over the beach, kind of mixed in with the limestone. And what they are is they're evidence of the burrowing organisms that lived, like that were there 460 million years ago. So I kind of, decided to document something that spoke to that. So a few weeks later, the caterpillars had given way to the infestation of fish flies. The water hole had risen, and I found stones in a smelly concoction of algae and dead insects. And I was really upset at first. The stagnant water created these tide lines on the paper. A tide line is a historical term used to describe watermarks on that stain photographic prints. It's, you might have some old prints that have flood marks on them. Those are tide lines. So to me, the dead fish flies in the prints symbolized a fragile and ephemeral, whoops. Okay, sorry, there's another one there that I just wanted to show you. That one sort of became the environment. That's my favorite stone, paper stone. It took on the kind of the surface and texture, almost like a lichen. I think it's created from the algae in the water, because this one was kind of buried, and I dug it out. So to me, the dead fish flies on the prints symbolize a fragile and ephemeral ecosystem. And the eroded paper stones are like petrified remains. I gathered up all my materials before leaving, of course, and I put some of my extra paper experiments on my dining room table. And then the next day I noticed that there was this cocoon inside one of the curled up papers, and that the wind had blown around. So I put it outside, and it was kind of interesting because a couple days later the caterpillar had emerged. So I thought that was kind of a neat collaboration. I also experimented at the site with 15-foot pieces of photographic paper. The paper was left on the stone beach overnight. Okay, this is a lumen print, which was what I call lumen print. It was exposed in the UV rays. And I quickly covered the paper up with stones on the beach. And so I wanted to kind of document the texture and just the subject of the stone beach. So I left it on the beach overnight, and the water was moving. I don't know if you can see, but there's kind of puddle areas in there, and the water was coming up and down in the beach and affected the paper like a chemical reaction on the photographic paper. So an interesting colors also happened, which was I wasn't expecting, and that reference, and the shadows also kind of reference time, because they are sort of graduating towards the shadow of the colored parts, which is actually where the rocks block the sunlight completely. So it remains in a plastic bag right now because it's unfixed. I did manage to document it with digital software, like my camera, stitching, and I printed it onto a 15-foot piece of poly silk, which was kind of another way of fixing the image. And I haven't documented it properly yet because it's 15 feet, and so I have to do that and light it properly. So I'm getting there, midway through the project in 2016, I attended an artist residency in Miami in partnership with Art Center South Florida and MAWA. My plan was to research the rising sea levels and effect of hurricanes on the king tides along Miami's coast. So Miami is close to sea level, and which means that monsoon weather and king tides result in urban flooding very easily that comes up through the underground sewer systems. I wanted to capture the movement of the rising water level on photographic paper, but it wasn't working because, it was moving, the water was moving too slowly, I suppose. So I secured the paper along a floating dock to get a more defined watermark. These prints are about 5.5 feet tall, and I called it stilts. Tide lines on other images happened to be in line with my mouth, which made me think about my physical relationships to water. The prints evoked ideas about breathing and buoyancy and the impact of water systems on human environments. Many of the earlier piers still remain in Miami as stark reminders of how rising sea levels are threatening coastal environments. After Miami, I started to formulate ideas about the exhibition at 1CO3 and spent an afternoon in the gallery. I wanted to incorporate some kind of a human-built structure into the exhibition. This was when I decided to investigate the piers of Denotter, which are seasonal, and they enable human contact or human interaction with Lake Winnipeg. So I focused on one particular pier, Selkirk Pier, which is a bit more secluded, so that I wouldn't get in people's way. The prints had to dry. Oh, okay, this is, I'll just explain this. This is, again, large photographic paper wrapped around a contraption that I built out of galvanized tubes. And I would wrap the paper in black plastic, bring it out, unwrap it, drop it, tie it, and get an exposure. Allow the lake to sort of make its mark. My exhibition, Littoral Landscape, is an immersive multimedia installation that dialogues with 1CO3's long, narrow space. I envisioned the pier emerging out of the wall and extending down into the center of the gallery. I wanted fragments of a floating pier to invite visitors to move between the poles that respond to air movement. So the watermarks actually do correspond to the average height, I would say, of a human respiratory system, which you can see if you look closely. This installation also investigates the pier as a temporary structure because they are seasonal and also because they're declining in number. There used to be 16 public piers, there's about 8 now, and there used to be about 100 private piers, and there's 20. The poles are constructed out of commercial photographic paper, these poles, which is also approaching the end of production. So there's that connection, and the watermarks were never fixed in the darkroom, leaving them unstable, and the images will continue to expose and change over the course of the exhibition. So I think of pier with its fading watermarks as a spectral relic from an earlier age. As my work is site responsive, I couldn't help but make a connection between the lake's edge and the gallery's context within a university setting. A shoreline is a protein environment always in a state of flux. It's a porous landscape where information passes through and is absorbed. I was thinking about the university campus as a metaphorical shoreline. In this multimedia installation, I'm examining the interconnections between aquatic and human ecosystems along the water's edge. As Professor of Geography Nora Casson put it, these areas are zones of confluence where different physical conditions smash up against each other. Shoreline is a video of unceasing waves that push through an eroding embankment of sandbags printed with photographs of the stone beach. The upper half of the wall is black to evoke infinite outdoor space. It's my hope that these elements will draw visitors into the gallery and that they may experience this exhibition as an intersection of physical knowledge and imaginative space. The installations explore ideas around temporality, urgency, control, and failure. My research has included the unusual wind tides and water levels of this shallow inland ocean, which had led to my investigation of humans, the lake, and the piers as parallel breathing systems. In closing, I hope that this exhibition will encourage anyone to consider our interactions with natural water systems and their influence on the evolution of shorelines. So I want to end with a 4-minute kind of documentary, and it shows the area that I was working in.